Hello, my name is Jeremy Arnold. I'm a senior business intelligence developer here at OneBridge in Indianapolis. Now that we've talked about how to get it in and how to wrangle that data, we now have to ask sort of a separate question. Power BI offers two distinct ways of getting data into your data model. Importing, bringing it in memory, which is what most people will commonly do, versus direct query, leaving the data in its home storage, but querying it. There are a myriad of situations where you may not have an alternative but to use a direct query model. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of that approach and discuss when it may or may not be necessary to do so.
Now, direct query is a system of getting data that involves not bringing it into your local data model, but querying a database, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, that has your data for you, and just going and asking the server that the database is on for that information repeatedly. This can be, there are definitely use cases for it. There are times where a direct query model is the appropriate choice. There are times where it's not the appropriate choice. There can be a whole host of concerns around when and why and how. So we're going to talk about when to direct query, what are some of the things you should keep and track or keep in your head, what are some things you should be thinking about, when do you direct query versus when do you import. So the first thing to think about is the size of your data model. If you're going to be doing something that you need refreshed all the time, like say your data is constantly changing, and you understand that bringing it into your data model on this kind of refresh schedule would be difficult because you would constantly be refreshing your data model, maybe it makes sense to direct query in that environment, right? So you have this data constantly coming in, you need to know exactly what happened like 5 seconds ago, and the database has that information, and you need to refresh a query and be able to go. You're not going to do that in an imported data model, right? Because an imported data model is static until it is refreshed. Data on the server side, that's the database's business, and you're just querying it. It's the database's world, and you're just living in it in a direct query model, right? So in that kind of situation, maybe that makes sense. Next thing to think about is the size of your data model. If you're thinking about the size of your data model and you're like, well, it's like 1 million rows between all my tables, and it doesn't really change that often, well, is that really something worth direct querying? I mean, if your database is performant, you might not notice too big of a difference, but being in memory is always going to be superior in performance to having to query a database. Because anytime you're querying a database, you have to send the script. The script has to be taken by the machine, translated, then it has to go get the data together in the format you've requested, then it has to send it back. Whereas if it's in memory, it's just doing the calculation and it's providing you the result. So generally, for more nimble data models that don't have to be refreshed all the time, even like something like daily, you may want to consider setting up an imported data model. And once it's in the Power BI service, which we're not going to talk too much about today, but even in the service, when you start to reschedule refreshes, you can schedule daily or weekly refreshes for these imported data models. So that can be really, really powerful. And the performance is, like I said, always going to be better than it will be in a direct query environment. But, sometimes you don't have a lot of choice in the matter. There's a number of environments where you may have regulatory requirements which state, no, you don't get to bring that data into your data model. You don't have ownership of that data. You can query it, but you can't have any trace of it on your local machine, right? Whether, maybe for HIPAA reasons or other compliance reasons, you just can't do that. In those cases, a direct query model may be your only choice. And in those cases, you will want to work with the database administrator to ensure that those databases are as performant as possible, right? Because you may not have another choice, but you still want to visualize things about that data. You may want to aggregate pieces of that data very quickly. There's still insights to be had, even though you can't have it on your local machine. So in those situations, a direct query may be the appropriate data model. The other things to think about are, if, let's say you don't have a data model that is, that has to be refreshed very often, but it's still very large. If it's just something you're doing locally, you can have a PBIX file that exceeds 1 gigabyte. Nothing says you can't do that. The question is whether or not you plan on pushing it up to the Power BI service, where unless you have a premium account, and most users aren't using premium, and those who are using it in very specific ways. If you're in Power BI Pro, you have this 1 gigabyte file size limit that you can push up to service. So if you're going to exceed that, then you are going to be in a situation where you may have to use direct query. And if you're using direct query from Power BI service to a non-cloud data source, then you have to talk and set up some data gateways, and there's some extra hoops that you're going to have to jump through in some of those situations. And in others, if you already have your data out in the cloud and it's connecting to a cloud source, you may not have to do that, right? But that's something that you'll have to talk with your DBAs about and sort of really understand where that data is. Is it on-prem or is it on the cloud? What is the data source, and do you need a enterprise data gateway for those kinds of environments? So those will be questions you'll have to ask in a direct query environment. So now that we've sort of talked about the whys of direct query, let's talk about the what of direct query. So here I have the example I had earlier today. I just pulled one table into the data model, right? It's this combined sales report table from this database that's in Azure. And I'm direct querying it, which means I don't have the data local to my machine. Power BI, as I put things together, writes queries and sends them to the database. And we can see, as we've looked at other things today, most of the other stuff we've done today has been in memory, and you've seen it be very fast and very performant, with the exception of my one map, which I just had way too much stuff going on my machine otherwise, so I apologize for that. I promise it's normally a better experience. But otherwise, like this, you'll notice is very different. So the example I showed earlier today was a simple table where I wanted to know it was division. So it was gross margin by division. Right? Well, before this would already be over, but now it's having to write this query. So it's saying select division and some gross margin from the table, group by division, right? So it has to take the table I'm building, has to translate that to a SQL statement. It has to send that SQL statement to the database. The database has to then take the SQL statement, translate it, verify it's a legit query, right? Because anytime you write a query to a database, it has to validate the query works. Validates the query works. There are no syntax errors, and then compiles the data, and then sends me the data back, right? So there's a lot of steps that kind of go through in that direct query environment. And it doesn't matter how complex or how simple it is, that's the process it's going to go through. Now, the more I change things, it's going to have to change. So right now, the default summarization you can see for gross margin is sum. Well, what if I change it to average? Oh, that didn't happen immediately, did it? No, it had to, again, write the query. Now, that was pretty fast, but it still wasn't in memory fast, which is really the point I want to hammer home. There's never going to be a time, again, where a direct query model is as fast as an in-memory one. But there are lots of advantages to direct query. You don't have the data on a local machine. The data is still in the database. It never leaves really the database, except for those pieces of the query results that are sent to your visualizations here. It can be a great option for regulatory reasons. And if you have a highly performant database, it can be very, very snappy. It's one of those things where you'll want to, like I said, to ask those questions, and you may have to talk to the database administrator for the database and or databases that you want to query, and make sure you're on the same page. Now, with Direct Query, you can only be connected to one data source at a time. So you can't be in an environment where you're querying database A, and then I have database B over here, and I'm going to query it sometimes, and I'm going to join them in some way. You can't do that, right? In an imported data model, you can do that because they're each individual data sources, and you're pulling specific things from them. And maybe in your data model on the back end, you're creating these connections between these things. Well, in a direct query environment, you don't have the opportunity to do that because the databases can't really talk to each other in that way, right? They're separate databases. And you can't write queries to one database that joins to another database because those databases aren't the same. It's going to go, I don't know why you're asking me to do it. So the default thing it'll tell you is this: I'm sorry, in a direct query model, you can't be connected to more than one data source at a time. And that also includes, by the way, sort of queried results that you may form as like temp tables and stuff that may connect to this environment, or be like sort of in memory. You can't connect those to the larger database either. So if you're direct querying something, you want to make sure you understand the database structure fairly well, so you know you're getting the data you want out of it. Now you can still do things like create DAX measures, and you can do those types of things. And we'll talk a little bit more about DAX on another time, because I'm a big fan of DAX, and that's the data expression language for Power BI. You can still do some really cool stuff with DAX and create measures, and you can even do some stuff around some columns and stuff like that. Because again, those all just get translated to SQL statements, but you have to be aware that the more you do those things, the harder it is, or the more complex the queries are going to get, because it has to wrap all of those changes into SQL statements. And the more complicated your SQL statements get, the harder it's going to be for the database to take those in, translate them, and turn them back around to a result. So that's just something to keep in mind. Direct Query is a fantastic tool. I know I may not have made it sound that way, but it is a very, very good tool. It works, and the fact that it works as well as it does is pretty incredible. So, to recap, in some situations you may not have a choice but to use a direct query model. If you do have to use a direct query model, understand the database structure. Try to understand what you're getting out of these databases, understand what's in each of the tables, understand how you're going to join those tables together in the data model on the back end, and kind of have that work in place. And talk to your database administrator so they know what to expect as you query that database, because let's say you want to query a database that maybe does more staging items for some reason, or just isn't really designed for a lot of extra traffic. It might be helpful to let the DBA know to expect that, and if they need to give you a little extra juice, that they can work with you on that.
All right, so now that we've been through all three parts of our webinar today, getting the data in, wrangling it, and understanding when to import versus direct query, I hope you found this to be a good experience. I know I've enjoyed it speaking with you today, and I certainly hope that you've gotten something out of it. Again, my name is Jeremy Arnold. I'm a senior BI developer here at OneBridge, and I hope you'll be reaching out to us soon with your business intelligence needs. Thank you so much, and have a great day.